Families across the U.S. walk into Walmart, Costco, and other grocery chains expecting seafood to be safe, affordable, and healthy. But behind the freezers and fish counters, a different reality is unfolding. Prices for salmon, tilapia, tuna, cod, shrimp, catfish, and trout have doubled, while reports of contamination, unsanitary farming conditions, and recalls tied to antibiotics and parasites are growing. What was once the cheap protein is now a risk for both your wallet and your health. Before you buy fish again at Walmart or Costco, you need to know what's really happening. Let's start. Part 1. Sticker Shock, the 7 Fish, and the Receipt. That story began when households quietly swapped ribeyes for fillets and burgers for cans of tuna, betting that seafood would offer protein, omega-3s, and savings in one move. Meat fatigue made fish the fallback, the way parents kept lunchboxes full without wrecking the month. Even so, a fallback fails when the ground shifts beneath it, and 2025 has shifted nearly everything that touches the ocean or the cold chain. As a consequence of this, what once felt like smart frugality now feels like a corner with no exit. Plan B just broke. Meanwhile, the first blow landed on salmon, the poster child for affordable health at the Warehouse Club. In 2023, you could find fillets around $8.99 a pound. But by 2025, the same cuts sit in the $15 to $16 range, nearly double. However, this is not sticker drama, it is arithmetic. Because drought in Chile and Norway, starved farms of clean water and oxygen, disease outbreaks thinned crowded pens, and U.S. tariffs on Chile layered cost on scarcity. As a consequence of this, family packs that once stretched a week now disappear from carts. The healthy option hurts now. By the way, you'll never know what's really hidden in your plate at chains like these. Subscribe now and protect yourself before your next bite. Even so, the so-called budget fish, tilapia, refuse to stay cheap. At Walmart or Aldi, frozen bags that lived at $4 or $5 now park between $7 and $8, and that gap feels endless on a tight list. However, those numbers ride on tariffs hitting China and Latin America, feed costs surging nearly 40%, and sanitary scandals that triggered recalls and yanked volume offline. As a consequence of this, the last reliable cushion for working households deflates in plain view. Budget fish, busted safety net. Meanwhile, cod, the quiet classic in fish sticks, Friday fries, and baked family pans, faced its own reckoning. In 2023, a pound hovered near $7. In 2025, 12 becomes the new normal, a 60% climb. However, the villain wears a temperature map because North Atlantic waters warmed, biomass shrank, and quotas in Iceland and Canada tightened exports while shipping and insurance added a second tax. As a consequence of this, parents who relied on mild cod for kids now juggle fewer and pricier options. Climate taxes your plate. Even so, the pantry anchor, canned and fresh tuna, stopped feeling safe. 4-packs from school lunch brands that slipped under $5 now land $8 to $9, and that difference multiplies across a month. However, the cost stack is brutal and layered, with global fuel spikes raising boat and freight costs, stricter mercury testing adding compliance expenses, and overfishing thinning schools that once felt infinite. As a consequence of this, the simplest American protein loses its role as the dependable backstop. Lunchbox loses its lifeline. Meanwhile, shrimp, the Costco freezer favorite that made ordinary nights feel like a celebration, doubled in some stores from roughly $5 to almost $10 a bag. However, the shock traces to a single lever, a 25% duty reimposed on Indian shrimp, even though India supplies more than a third of U.S. demand, plus disease waves in Asian farms, and a U.S. Gulf fleet too small to fill the gap. As a consequence of this, cocktail rings and weeknight stir-fries slip into the special occasion column. Cocktail turns luxury. Even so, the American South felt a different ache with catfish, long considered local, steady, and fair. In 2023, fillets lived around $6.50. By 2025, $9 becomes uncomfortably common, a 40% jump. However, feed prices surged on corn and soy shocks, while drought in the Mississippi basin strained ponds and crews, and domestic farms hit real capacity limits. As a consequence of this, regional comfort food drifts out of reach for the very communities that built it. Local staple priced out. Meanwhile, trout, the supposed affordable cousin of salmon, stepped out of its lane and into the same price bracket. A $7 pound now reads 11, erasing the bargain logic that sent shoppers to the trout case first. However, farms in Idaho and Colorado wrestled with drought and warmer water, while energy and feed made aquaculture bills heavier every month, leaving operators little choice but to raise tags. As a consequence of this, the easy swap that once saved dinner no longer saves the budget. No cheap swap left. Even so, the 7 species together draw a single pressure curve, with rises from 30% to over 100% landing across chains and regions at once. However, synchronized spikes rarely come from random chance. They come from systems colliding, where tariffs meet climate, where disease meets capacity, and where fuel meets distance. As a consequence of this, the seafood aisle stops being a collection of products and starts reading like a map of global stress. This is systemic, not random. Meanwhile, inflation explains only the headline, not the plot. And the plot includes import duties, droughts, quota cuts, biosecurity failures, shipping volatility, and safety recalls that yank pallets off floors. However, tracing each fish back through the pipeline shows how one policy or one weather pattern turns into a higher shelf tag months later, after boats, farms, trucks, and warehouses have absorbed the blow. As a consequence of this understanding, the path becomes the first tool for beating the price. Let's follow the pipeline. Even so, there is a political fuse already hissing under that pipeline because reimposed tariffs in 2025 tried to protect producers and ended up taxing shoppers, and the public anger no longer stays on the receipt. However, before the blame game begins, the mechanism has to be clear, species by species, cost by cost, so the cure does not repeat the cause. As a consequence of this, the next chapter leaves the glass case and enters the policy engine room. Policy meets pantry next. Part 2. Tariff Trap. How policy collided with supply, climate, and safety. However, a tariff isn't a headline, it's a meter that keeps running because an import duty multiplies every cost downstream. A 25% levy on a $10 kilogram doesn't just make it $12.50 at the dock. Freight, storage, and retail margin stack on top until the shopper pays the compound. Meanwhile, the wholesaler can't swallow it forever, so the surcharge walks to the register in plain sight. The bill lands at home. Even so, salmon shows how multiple levers crush one species at once, as Chile and Norway struggled through low oxygen summers while sea lice flare-ups forced culls. Then a U.S. tariff on Chilean fish added dollars per pound to what remained. In 2023, the math penciled. By 2025, the same fillet carried 2 shocks, less supply, and extra tax. As a consequence of this, a family staple became a spreadsheet problem overnight. Triple squeeze, one species. Meanwhile, shrimp reveals what happens when the duty hits the dominant supplier because India ships more than a third of America's shrimp and now faces a flat 25% wall. Freight didn't fall, farm disease didn't pause, and Gulf landings can't fill a national habit built on imports. However, once the low-cost anchor lifts, every rung on the ladder climbs with it. One tariff, huge shock. But the most surprising thing is how a so-called budget species like tilapia buckled when the cheap lanes closed, as duties on China and Latin America met freight spikes, and a roughly 40% surge in feed made every harvest pricier. Processors tried to resize bags and stretch promotions, yet the $7 to $8 shelf tag stuck. As a consequence of this, the backstop fish stopped backstopping. Cheap lanes closed overnight. On the other hand, cod proves climate can be a policy whether we vote on it or not, because warming in the North Atlantic shaved biomass and pushed regulators to cut quotas in Iceland and Canada to protect the stock. Fewer allowable tons meant fewer exportable fillets, and shipping insurance added a second toll on the ocean lane. Meanwhile, protection did its job while prices rose anyway. Quotas protect, prices rise. Even so, tuna reminds us that cans don't cancel economics. As fuel indexes pushed boat days higher, mercury compliance added lab costs per lot, and overfishing limits throttled catch volumes. A 4-pack that sat under $5 in 2023 now lands near $9 because every link in the chain learned the same expensive word, compliance. As a consequence of this, pantry math stings the lunchbox. Cans aren't immune. However, domestic aquaculture didn't step in like a hero, since catfish farmers in the Mississippi Basin watched feed bills jump on corn and soy shocks while drought shrank pond margins. New ponds require permits, capital, and time, and processors can't conjure capacity in a quarter. Meanwhile, demand kept knocking on a door that opened slowly by design. We can't ramp fast. On the other hand, safety pulled pounds off the market exactly when they were most needed. As listeria recalls cleared freezers, antibiotic residues triggered rejects, and even plastic fragments forced tuna and salmon lots into dumpsters. Each recall removes weeks of inventory that can't be replaced by flipping a switch. As a consequence of this, scarcity deepens without selling a single extra pound. Safety shrinks inventory. Even so, retailers tried to soften the blow with tactics, shrinking promotions, trimming pack sizes from 2 pounds to 24 ounces, and leaning on previously frozen signs at the fresh counter to rebuild flexibility. The quality can be excellent when IQF is done right, but the story on the sign no longer sounds like abundance. Meanwhile, shoppers learn to read labels like line items. Fresh becomes flexible. However, the playbook looks familiar if you remember the meat chains not to eat video investigation. Check it out, where industrial shortcuts wore the word fresh like perfume. Glazing, aggressive thaw windows, and creative nomenclature return at the seafood case because pressure is pressure, no matter the protein. As a consequence of this, the aisle changed uniforms, not tactics. Same playbook, new aisle. Even so, numbers alone don't create headlines until households feel cornered, and 2025 has turned cornering into a weekly ritual. Receipts post the evidence, fridges echo the emptiness, and policy statements read hollow next to a doubled shrimp tag. As a consequence of this, the narrative hardens into 2 words on every talk show and timeline. Now the fury ignites. Part 3. Backfire, Households, Retailers, and the Politics of Blame. However, the breaking point didn't arrive as a single headline. It arrived as a curve that bent week after week in 2025. Salmon passed $15 a pound, shrimp bags doubled toward 10, and the 7-species basket rose 30 to 100%, depending on the zip code. Meanwhile, the substitutions that saved budgets in 2024 ran out of road because every swap now cost the same pain in a different package. Families hit the wall. By the way, without subscribing, the next time you sit down at a chain restaurant, you'll have no idea what risks are riding on that fork. Subscribe today, or keep eating in the dark. Even so, the most honest ledger lives in kitchens, where triage replaced habit. A family that served salmon every Friday now pencils it into 1 Friday a month. Another crossed shrimp off the calendar entirely and stretched pasta instead. Meanwhile, canned tuna, once the lunchbox constant under $5 a 4-pack, gets rationed to every other week at 8 or 9. Dinners lose the anchor. On the other hand, retailers tried to look steady while quietly moving the goalposts. End cap promos thinned, 2-pound bags shrank to 24 ounces, and private label lines expanded into slots where national brands used to sit. Meanwhile, managers' special labels appeared on thawed fillets that would have been sold frozen last year. Stores play defense. However, suppliers read the tariff board and pivoted faster than shoppers could. Exporters in Chile and India rerouted inventory to markets with lower duties and easier customs, from the Gulf states to East Asia. Meanwhile, U.S. buyers discovered that a 25% wall doesn't just raise prices here, it invites the world to walk around us. We lose first dibs. Even so, the political script flipped because a tariff sold as protection looked like a tax at checkout. Prices climbed, availability thinned, and the households that policy claimed to shield saw the bruise on the receipt. Meanwhile, the phrase of 2025 hardened into a single verdict that neither side could spin away. Protection hurts protectees. On the other hand, the fallout showed up clearest in salmon and shrimp, the 2 banners of the seafood aisle. Holiday circulars once led with salmon at $8.99 vanished into base tags of $15 to $16, and shrimp rings that anchored gatherings doubled toward $10 a bag without the party-sized discount. Meanwhile, Lent and summertime grilling ran into bare promos and thin slots. Fishless Fridays return. However, the price of dinner isn't just money. It's nutrients. And omega-3s don't leap from refined carbs when fish disappears. The widely cited 2 servings a week target turns theoretical when households retreat to cheaper calories and processed meats. Meanwhile, the savings on paper can become costs in blood pressure and triglycerides later. Health pays too. Even so, the pain is uneven by region, and geography tells the bill in accents. Southern towns that rely on domestic catfish feel the 40% climb as a cultural tax on fish fries and church suppers. Mountain West shoppers watch Idaho, Colorado trout dry up under drought. Meanwhile, coastal families see Gulf shrimp boats land short while imports stall behind tariffs. Every region bleeds differently. On the other hand, price wasn't the only trust fracture. Labels took hits under fluorescent lights. Fresh carried a quiet asterisk when thawed then sold became standard practice. Glaze weights hid thinner fillies, and country of origin tags shifted between adjacent hooks. Meanwhile, shoppers started timing thaw windows and learning what previously frozen really implies. Labels face a reckoning. However, frustration needed a megaphone, and social feeds obliged with viral receipts, empty ice cases, and the meme that said it all in one image: $20 salmon where 8 once lived. Hashtags braided the anecdotes into a narrative, and the phrase "tariff backfire" jumped from comments to chyrons. Meanwhile, store managers learned to brief crews before the cameras came out. The outrage organizes. Even so, retailers didn't accept fate. They marched data to policymakers asking for targeted exclusions, faster inspections on safe lanes, and relief on duties that punish end consumers. Lawmakers countered with producer protection and national capacity goals. Meanwhile, the standoff hardened into a staring contest above a freezer full of shrinking choices. Who bends first? On the other hand, the next move can't be outrage alone. It has to be method. What worked in other aisles, proof-based buying, smarter swaps, and collective leverage can steady seafood too. Meanwhile, the path from policy to pantry can be walked backward with receipts, questions, and alternatives that keep protein on the plate without surrendering the budget. Time to take control. Part 4. From Panic to Playbook. Buying smart when fish doubles. However, outrage doesn't feed a family. A plan does. And tonight, the plan has to work under 7 simultaneous pressures. Salmon, tilapia, cod, tuna, shrimp, catfish, and trout climb together because tariffs, droughts, quotas, fuel, disease, recalls, and capacity hit at once. Meanwhile, there isn't a single lever that drops them all tomorrow, which means survival looks like method, not miracles. As a consequence of this, you need a lane you can drive every week. Choose your lane now. Even so, the first rule is counterintuitive. Buy less, buy better, and time it. 4-ounce portions of oily fish still deliver meaningful omega-3s when the cut is quality and fresh enough to use without waste. On the other hand, weekends rarely win on price. Midweek markdowns often beat Sunday circulars by dollars per pound. Meanwhile, freezing half the haul the day you buy preserves value and flavor. As a consequence of this, smaller can feed smarter. Quality beats quantity. But the most surprising thing is how smart swaps keep nutrients while trimming the bill, because trout can stand in for salmon when farms in Idaho recover inventories, and Alaskan pollock or hake can anchor cod recipes at a lower tag. Meanwhile, sardines or mackerel replace tuna in salads and melts while delivering dense omega-3s per ounce. As a consequence of this, the recipe survives even when the hero changes. Swap without losing nutrients. On the other hand, geography inside the store matters almost as much as geography on the map. Warehouse clubs win on bulk when you split packs, yet ethnic markets and neighborhood fishmongers often undercut chains on species they move fast. Meanwhile, many grocers mark down near sell-by at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., which beats waiting for a weekend ad that never lands. As a consequence of this, your route is part of the budget. Hunt beyond one aisle. However, a label can save you or sink you, so read it like an auditor. Country of origin tells you the lane the fish traveled. Previously frozen can be a quality advantage if the glaze isn't hiding excess water weight. Meanwhile, STPP on the ingredient line signals moisture retention that inflates price per edible ounce, not value. As a consequence of this, the fine print protects your plate. Scan before you pay. Even so, promises without paperwork are just decoration, and our Subway callback proves it. Centralized claims about value dissolve under pressure without receipts. Ask the counter for harvest dates, thaw logs, and lot codes. Ask brands for 2025 mercury and heavy metal PDFs by SKU, not brochures. Meanwhile, retailers who publish testing earn repeat business even with higher tags because they trade adjectives for evidence. As a consequence of this, questions lower risk immediately. Show me the report. On the other hand, frozen done right is not a downgrade, it's a rescue. IQF fillets thaw evenly, portion perfectly, and turn waste into near zero when you only defrost what you need. Meanwhile, fishermen flash freeze at peak freshness, which often beats fresh that spent 3 days above ideal temperatures. As a consequence of this, the freezer becomes a tool, not a surrender. Frozen isn't failure. However, protein stability across the week keeps panic out of the cart, so build a pantry that smooths the spikes. Canned salmon holds omega-3s for months, sardines and olive oil deliver power on toast, and anchovies vanish into sauces while lifting flavor. Meanwhile, eggs, beans, and yogurt round out affordable protein, so fish can be occasional and excellent. As a consequence of this, your menu stops chasing prices. Keep protein steady. Even so, recipes are your multiplier because technique stretches dollars while hiding compromise. A single pound of shrimp becomes 6 hearty servings when it swims with tomatoes, fennel, and pasta water. Canned salmon turns into crisp-edged patties with lemon, dill, and crumbs. Trout flakes into a skillet pilaf that feeds 4 with 1 pan. Meanwhile, spices and stock cubes cost pennies but sell satisfaction. As a consequence of this, you stretch without starving flavor. Stretch without starving flavor. On the other hand, buying alone is expensive. Buying together rewrites the math. Community-supported fisheries offer shares that beat retail volatility. Co-ops arrange bulk orders at landed cost, and neighbor splits turn a 10-pound club pack into 3 families' dinners. Meanwhile, group chats can track markdown times at local stores better than any app. As a consequence of this, leverage becomes local and immediate. Outsmart the tariff together. However, household playbooks scale faster when policy stops tripping them, and relief has a shape you can name. Targeted tariff exemptions for audited suppliers, fast-track inspection lanes for low-risk origins, temporary feed cost credits to stabilize domestic ponds, and quota diplomacy that protects biomass while securing predictable volumes. These are the levers with receipts. Meanwhile, retailers can pledge to publish contaminant tests and recall histories per SKU each quarter. As a consequence of this, pressure points become progress points. Pressure the right levers. Even so, the last step isn't moralizing, it's maintenance. Replace panic with competence. Ritualize your midweek check of specials. Keep 2 back pocket recipes that honor cheaper species. And remember our meat chain's callback. Fresh is a claim until the numbers agree. Meanwhile, the 3 motifs stay on your fridge door: price versus plate, policy to pantry, proof over promises, so dinner returns to what it's meant to be. As a consequence of this, the meal belongs to you again. Make the meal yours again.